I think we can all agree that one of the best things about Batman the Animated Series is the way they handled the villains. They gave a lot of love and attention, not just to the big names like the Joker, Catwoman and the Penguin, but also the more obscure villains like Mr. Freeze, Clayface and Two-Face. One of those obscure villains is the subject of today's video, Poison Ivy. Now, one of the things that I think many people don't realise is that before Batman the Animated Series, Poison Ivy had never appeared outside of the comic books, and even then, she was a mostly forgettable, vaguely plant-themed villain. When she was introduced in Batman 181 in 1966, Poison Ivy's motivations were to become rich and famous. According to her co-creator Carmine Infantino, Ivy was originally created as a throwaway female villain, with the potential for her to be used in the Adam West starring show. The only reason Poison Ivy came about was because of Catwoman on the Batman show. They wanted more female villains. That show, because of it, we were selling 1 million copies a month. But that show, when it died, so did the comic books. I don't find this throwaway remark about Poison Ivy surprising after I read her debut. A lot of Batman's villains' origins are revealed in their first appearance, but Poison Ivy just appears with no real psychological motivation or backstory driving her. No, instead she has shallow motivations. She wants to be the best, the most beautiful female villain in Gotham, and she uses her sexuality as a weapon, occasionally supplementing her feminine wiles with a blowgun loaded with poison darts, hypnotic lipstick, and explosive hair. Moving on. Beyond her plant costume and chloroform lipstick, she didn't really have much of a gimmick other than being attractive and wanting to ensnare Batman. So it's not hard to see why she didn't really make many appearances over the next decade. In fact, she didn't even get a proper origin until the 1970s in issue 252 of World's Finest, in the second part of a two-part story pitting her in a sapphic battle with Wonder Woman. Ivy was identified by the FBI as Lillian Rose, a young woman who had been betrayed by her college professor lover. Stating that he was too poor to be able to give her the life that she deserved, Lily stole a sample of ancient Egyptian herbs from a museum, thinking that if he could study the herbs, he'd find fame and fortune and finally be able to marry her. Unfortunately, he double-crossed her, making her ingest some of the herb, leaving her for dead, and running off with the herb with plans of selling it to the highest bidder. However, Lillian didn't die. Instead, she became resistant to poisons and had a thirst for revenge. She was also inexplicably able to transform her former lover into a tree man named Redwood, and force him to do her bidding. The early Poison Ivy is a woman scorned and lashes out at the world, but even this added dimension didn't see her popularity increase. For the next decade, she only really made a handful of appearances as a member of the Secret Society of Supervillains, but only as a background character rather than a major villain. In the 1980s, writer Doug Mensch brought Poison Ivy to prominence with a storyline in which she used her hypnotic lipstick to force the board of Wayne Enterprises to sign over control of the company to her. Mensch also leaned into the science fiction horror element of the character, having her work with a malevolent botanist to create an army of green ghost plant creatures that would follow her every command. The next big development of Poison Ivy's character would come from Neil Gaiman's short story in Secret Origins 36. Ivy is in prison and is visited by a recruiter from Task Force X, also known as the Suicide Squad, to see if she would make a good candidate for joining the team. During her interviews, she reveals that her previous origin was a lie and that her name is Pamela Lillian Isley. Studying under Jason Woodrue, the Floronic Man, she discloses that his experiments killed her, giving birth to Poison Ivy, the Queen of May, crowned in leaves and blossom and thorns. This story first sows the seeds of Ivy being more plant than person, but it wasn't really capitalized on in the comics. She does exhibit some control over plants, but also comes across as a deranged lunatic. Her most notable appearances came in the late 80s when Ivy joined the Suicide Squad. In this series, she was mostly used to control plants and hypnotize men with her kisses. But there was no benevolence. She acted entirely in her own self-interest. It's at this point that we come to Ivy's appearances in Batman the Animated Series. This show is the first time that Poison Ivy appeared outside of the comic books. Returning viewers of my videos will be familiar with the show's writer's philosophy of taking the best things from the comics and dropping all of the associated guff that had built up over the years. But for those that are here for the first time, here's an excerpt from Batman the Animated Series story editor Marty Pascoe's interview in Batman the Animated Podcast.
In our approach to the show, what we did is say, we are not going to be bound by any comics fans' idea of canon. We have a rich mythology here that goes back, at that point it was 60 years. And we said, why not just cherry pick from the best of it?
In the episode Pretty Poison, we are introduced to Pamela Isley, fiancée of District Attorney Harvey Dent, and a talented botanist working for a cosmetic company. While she puts on a front of being a fragrance designer, at heart she is an eco-warrior, not motivated by greed or vanity. Instead, she seeks revenge on Dent for indirectly causing the extinction of a breed of rose with the construction of Blackgate Penitentiary 5 years ago. Gone are the male botanists whose coattails Ivy would ride, and gone is the connection to the plant being from another dimension Jason Woodrow, at least until the Batman and Harley Quinn movie a couple of decades later. Ivy is her own woman, and no one is propping her up. She uses a combination of her own natural beauty and a potent poison of her own creation to lure Dent in before she finishes him off with a tainted kiss. It's interesting to note that Bruce Timm, who is often credited as the driving force behind the look of BTAS, struggled with the design of Poison Ivy. He recounted in his Modern Masters book, "There's a really talented cartoonist/artist named Lynn Naylor. She designed Poison Ivy because at the time my female characters were just coming out too stiff and too masculine." In the same book, Timm describes his design for Poison Ivy as horrible, citing the proportions as an area he struggled with. BTAS's Ivy is genuinely unhinged and sees no issue with murdering someone for causing harm to plants. Additionally, she was able to create a gigantic and vaginal-looking Venus flytrap that seemingly had a taste for men. In Pretty Poison, Batman being ensnared and dragged towards the flytrap is a pretty overt metaphor for him succumbing to her and her vagina dentata, representing emasculation. Ivy, like many of the villains in BTAS, has a legitimate gripe with society, and she is entirely right to be outraged by the way that those in power are destroying the environment. But it's her methods that are wrong, and that's what brings her to the attention of Batman. Ivy's character is further fleshed out across BTAS and the new Batman adventures, although as the series continues, her motivations tend to focus more on accumulating wealth, presumably to fund her experiments. The writers of the show, particularly Paul Dini, lean into the idea that Ivy is a brilliant botanist, responsible for her hideous creations. She starts with creating her own deadly poisons, but eventually moves to creating plant-based life forms that do her bidding, all without anybody else's help. Horror-tinged Poison Ivy episodes like House and Garden and Chemistry are among some of the best in the entire series, so check those out if you haven't already. It's this characterization of Poison Ivy that has really defined the character since the 1990s. And yes, you could argue that her popularity could be in part due to Joel Schumacher's much maligned Batman and Robin, but I would argue that they took Pamela Isley down the same path. The other enduring contribution to the character of Poison Ivy provided by BTAS is her partnership with Harley Quinn. Initially framed as an odd couple close friendship with subtle hints at a sexual relationship between the two, DC has since taken the ball and ran past the censors of the 90s, placing Harley and Ivy in a relationship in both the comic books and the more recent Harley Quinn animated series. Batman the Animated Series took the relatively unknown and mostly unloved character of Poison Ivy and gave her some depth, inspiring a whole new generation of creators. Without this show, it's hard to believe that she would have made it to the big screen, or be prominently featured in shows like Gotham, Batwoman, and Harley Quinn. Thanks to viewer Alex Lemons, who suggested this video and sent me over some cool images to use.